New concerns tonight that Donald Trump's Florida resort, Mar-a-Lago, did not meet the standards needed to store top-secret classified documents.
You have this perfect storm of intelligence, interest, and poor security, all in one place in Florida.
According to a review by CNN's Kevin Liptak, security at Mar-a-Lago has come into question on several occasions in recent years. One night in 2017 at the resort, when Trump and then Japanese leader Shinzo Abe consulted on a sensitive national security issue, word of a North Korean missile launch, club guests were close enough to take photos like these. In view of the guests on the patio, documents were illuminated by the light of a cell phone.
The fact that he has these documents lying around and he shares it with a foreign national who happens to be a prime minister and who knows who else is incredibly serious, and it shows a general lack of understanding of how our national security system works.
Another post from a Mar-a-Lago guest showed the guest standing with an aide who he said held the president's nuclear launch code satchel. It was unclear how close the guest got to the satchel. In 2019, a Chinese businesswoman was arrested for trespassing at Mar-a-Lago.
She carried into Mar-a-Lago, or was able to carry into Mar-a-Lago, a modern-day burglar's toolkit,
including a thumb drive, a laptop, an external hard drive, and 4 cell phones. Prosecutors said they later found in her hotel room a device to detect hidden cameras and thousands of dollars in cash. One intelligence veteran worries about who else could have breached the compound at any point.
If I were a hostile intelligence service, I would have tried to have recruited a maintenance person, a maid, middle management, a secretary, one of the people that comes and goes within Mar-a-Lago all the time.
In 2018, while the president and first lady were at Mar-a-Lago, a college freshman was able to get onto the grounds by walking through a tunnel from the beach. Prosecutors said he was screened for weapons by the Secret Service at some point, but wasn't stopped from entering the property, even though he wasn't supposed to be there.
It was just waiting for disaster. You could walk into the pool. There's nobody standing there.
Author Lawrence Lamer has written a book on Mar-a-Lago and says he's been on the estate several times. Lamer says Trump's personal attitude towards security there is part of the problem.
He's perfectly comfortable at Mar-a-Lago. Why? Because he has to be adored. He can't stand to be alone. He wants to have people around him all of the time celebrating. So when he walks to Mar-a-Lago, people stand up. They're constantly standing up applauding him. He needs that. He's hungry for that.
Regarding the latest reporting of sensitive documents remaining at Mar-a-Lago, CNN has reported that one of Trump's attorneys claimed earlier this summer that no classified material remained at Mar-a-Lago. Trump and his allies have said he used his presidential prerogative to declassify the documents before leaving office, but they have not provided any evidence of a formal declassification process taking place. Wolf?
Good point. Brian Todd reporting. Excellent report. Thank you very, very much. Joining us now, CNN political analyst Carl Bernstein, one of the journalists who, of course, helped expose the Watergate scandal. Carl, thanks very much for joining us. Of all the lines Richard Nixon crossed, and you reported on that all the time, was he ever willing to put the country's national security in jeopardy, as former President Trump has, by taking top secret classified information to his Florida beach club?
No, what Nixon did do was use national security policy to his own political advantage. But we need to look at the Trump presidency and at Donald Trump as an event in the history of this country unlike anything we've seen. We have a president of the United States, Donald Trump, who we know demonstrably is a seditionist president. We know of his criminality beyond doubt. We know of his instability. And all of those things are known particularly by members of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill who have been so craven that they haven't spoken out about what they know. And I think that that's something we really need to look at, and we can talk about perhaps a little bit now.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. In the wake of the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago, Carl, Trump and his allies have fueled anger and distrust towards some of our nation's bedrock institutions, including the FBI and the Justice Department, federal courts for that matter as well. Did you ever think you'd see a former president of the United States show such little regard for these key American institutions?
No. Everything almost that Donald Trump did as the president, as he's doing as an ex-president, is unlike anything we've seen. We have Donald Trump and a far-right Republican Party, which is enthralled to his authoritarianism, to his excesses, and why Donald Trump, in part, has managed to produce, in terms of the legislative goals, the judicial goals of the far right, of Mitch McConnell and the judiciary, of authoritarianism, even to the point of really moving toward the acceptance of hatred in this country, the hatred of some religious groups, the hatred of some ethnicities. Not to say that it's the policy of the Republican Party, but rather that the individuals in the leadership of the Republican Party have not made it their business to say, this is not our agenda. Donald Trump's authoritarianism and racist appeals, that's not our agenda. We haven't had that. And I think one of the things that's happened has to do with journalism, has to do with our reporting. I don't know of many reporters on Capitol Hill, many national reporters understand from their sources, who are assistants and staff of most of the leaders of the Republican Party on the Hill, in the Senate, a great number of House members, they are being told how their bosses are in private despise Donald Trump, hold him in utter contempt, think he is a criminal, think he is dangerous. That's what many members of the Senate say, their aides say to me and others, the same in the House, and yet we allow the stories to go on that as if there is great belief in this president among these same Republican leaders and members of the Congress. We need, I did a story back, a year or two ago, 2 years ago, saying that 21 members of the Senate, according to their aides, despise Donald Trump, hold him in contempt, and I named them. And there was maybe one or two denials from those senators. I got a call the next day from a Republican senator. He said, Carl, the number is really closest to 40. This is the way Donald Trump, these Republicans in the leadership know who he is. They understand the danger to the country posed by him. And yet they are so craven, so afraid of being unelected, so afraid of being primaried, that they will not do what the Republicans during the Richard Nixon conspiracy did. Get up and say, we cannot have criminality in our president, former president, and he must be held accountable. And indeed, we are now seeing a president, a former president, who probably may face indictment in 3 different cases. We don't know that he will, but it certainly is possible.